A very warm welcome to everybody joining our session today. It's our second session of 4 around supply chains in action. So we have the opportunity to welcome back Colleen and Rory. Thanks for joining us for session 2. And also my pleasure to introduce everybody to David Croft, and I'll introduce our speakers shortly. You'll remember, if you managed to join session 1, we were talking a lot with Lauren Hyatt, one of the principal consultants in the UK, around the planning phase when we think about this topic. Today, what we're going to do is move into the doing phase. So it's going to be some real sort of, as we're in the process of supplier audits, assessments, what are some of the things that we can learn about there? So in this session, as we talk to the guys, we will assume that planning and gap analysis type phases are complete. So it's focusing on the action element. This is all around where strategies become systems, and so it becomes auditable. The session is recorded. We will share key takeaways and the call recording with everybody who joins us. And you do have a Q&A function at the very top of your screen. So please do ask any questions as we go through, but we will mute microphones just to help our presenters today as we move through. And so without further ado, let's introduce our speakers. Colleen, please, welcome back. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Vicky, and it's a delight to be back here again today. So good afternoon, everybody who's joining or going to be listening to this recording. My name is Colleen Theron. I am a tri-qualified lawyer. I'm also the founder and CEO of RDA International. For those of you not familiar with Audia, we are a purpose-driven specialist sustainability business and human rights consultancy with expertise in modern slavery. I have been working for over 30 years with businesses, supporting them to meet their legal obligations, but actually more, I think, more excitingly, developing best practice policy and processes that underpin their legal disclosures, and also in relation to capacity building. And I'm really excited about this topic today, because I think that we are living in an era where people are having to think about what they need to do and how they need to do it, and that was really what brought us together with Vicky and the team to put this particular series together. So thank you, Vicky.
You're welcome. Nice to have you back with us. Rory, hello again.
Thanks, Vicky. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rory Oake. I'm a senior consultant with Audia. I'm a lawyer by background, and I've worked with Audia for just over 6 years. I've worked with clients across different sectors on human rights and sustainability due diligence. And actually, one of the things that's always struck me is how consistent the challenges are when moving into the implementation stage of due diligence, no matter what sector you're in. So I'm really looking forward to getting into those challenges today.
Yeah, you're right. It's one thing saying you're going to do something very different, showing that you've done properly, isn't it? Rory, thank you. And David Croft, a colleague of mine for many years, welcome to the discussion. Please tell everybody about yourself.
Thanks, Vicky. Hi, everybody. I'm David. I've been at Bureau Veritas for 14 years, but I've been involved with human rights social compliance audits now for 25 years. My role at BV today is I'm Sustainability Solutions Director for Europe, and I'm helping colleagues and clients alike with everything to do with sustainability. So social compliance audits, environmental audits, sustainable traceability audits, etc.
Really good to have you with us, David. Thanks for jumping on. Okay, we're going to get straight into things actually then. So Colleen, let me ask you to kick us off. Why is it that the do phase, where we are today, why is that where most companies continue to struggle? Oh, Colleen, you're on mute actually. Sorry, we might have missed a couple of things there. It's all right.
I'll start again. Yeah, what I was actually saying is that what we recognized in preparing this and our discussions, of course, have gone past a year of talking around these particular issues, is that this do phase is so difficult because it's about how companies turn their commitments into real decisions. So, we might have, and what we see consistently is companies setting out their commitments, their strategies, their human rights policies, their modern slavery statements, but actually they don't necessarily embed those commitments. They don't give enough training and guidance to the people who are responsible for those commitments. So they don't necessarily look at roles and responsibilities as part of how they set their commitments. That leads me into the point that I think consultations and the way consultations are held within companies is often quite poor. Policies are put on an intranet, or they just emailed, this is our new policy, have a look at it. Maybe companies don't even do that. And so they don't always reflect the operational reality, and they're hard to implement. And I want to make the point that from a legal perspective, this is exactly where risk materializes, because the movement towards mandatory due diligence, and actually also in terms of legal liability, is that what is assessed is not so much what is in the commitment, although that is assessed in many benchmarks that we see around corporate human rights benchmark, the CCLA, for example, but more particularly how is a company demonstrating its actions? What is the follow-up? This is the point where policies don't protect them. And I think the other thing that is often a real challenge is that there is the exposure of internal silos. We still see how many organizations work in silos and struggle to bring this cross-functionality together. And that's often because they haven't properly thought through their governance structures, their roles and their responsibilities, and how to bring people on that journey of understanding what is required of them.
Yeah, it's interesting because we see something similar here, but I suppose it's about, and I'm going into health and safety, but is it reasonably practicable? What we're saying we want to do, can it really work? Interesting, Colleen. David, what do you think on this one?
Yes, from an auditor's perspective, it's interesting to listen to Colleen's points. I can build on them just a little bit. It starts to fall down. People struggle if people don't quite know their roles. We see a lot that facilities, for example, needing social audits, they want to rush to having a certificate. Maybe they don't think about the steps they need to take to actually get there. Have they got the right information about the program they need to follow? Have they prepared? Have they got systems in place? Are they actually ready for this? And sometimes they might plan, for example, for a social audit at the last minute. So it's a rush, and then they're not ready. And then things get called up in these audits that they wouldn't need to have done if everybody was just planning efficiently from the start.
And I think we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but Colleen, just coming back to you for a moment, are there mistakes that you're seeing that companies are making during implementation? Are there things that stand out from what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different trends from, many years of working on this. And I'm really interested in what David said, particularly around rushing and the roles and the responsibilities, the lack of understanding. I think there's a lack of understanding language in that as well. So, there may be an assumption at a group level, at a strategic level, that there are certain terms and requirements that are understood. But when you take that into factories, when you take that into, the tiers in your suppliers, there isn't necessarily that understanding around the language and what is expected. From our perspective, I mean, to me, what remains the biggest challenge is this treating due diligence as a tick box. And there was a lot of discussion around this when CS3D was coming under scrutiny with Omnibus and, what that looks like. And particularly also with the German Supply Chain Act, where there were very particular requirements around contracts and other things that led a discussion around this tick box element and focusing just on producing content and materials without even thinking about it. We see so many policies that are often unaligned, because there's silo thinking. So whistleblowing doesn't link properly with the human rights policy or the modern slavery statement, nor do the requirements link in. I think the other things that I see is poor documentation of decisions. So this leads in or links in also to the fact that many companies are doing things, they might not be doing things well, they might be just doing things badly, or they might not be doing things at all. But those companies that are doing things often don't document them properly. So I think understanding the value of process is really critical for every business, is documented process. It goes to risk mitigation, to legal liability mitigation, but actually it goes to good business practice. If I think about my own role as a CEO in a business, what do we need? We need processes so that that everyone understands where they have to file their documents, who they need to speak to, what they do. I mean, it's just on a bigger scale with companies. It's how that processes are documented. And I think the other, I mean, I can talk a lot about this, but I think the other piece that I'd like to highlight is actually the mindset around stakeholder engagement. There's often the thought that stakeholder engagement only goes to suppliers down tiers. Yes, that's one of your stakeholders, but actually operationally, who are your key stakeholders internally? Who are the people that should be part of inputting in your policies and procedures? How do you get sufficient governance structure so you have the buy-in and the reporting? And I think that those are the things that perhaps we need to see a lot more maturity around in the next 4 years, as the laws tighten up and as customer requirements kind of grow around these particular issues.
Okay, so understanding your stakeholders, but also the materiality element of this, where are the biggest risks and why? David, you're nodding along. I'm keen to hear what you're thinking as Colleen's talking.
Yeah, no, it's interesting actually being in this webinar. I'm enjoying listening to Colleen as well as trying to work out what I'm going to say. The thing I see quite often historically over the last 2 decades I've been involved with this is quite often brands and retailers will focus on their tier 1. Colleen touched on a really important point just then, CS3D. For people that are going to have to follow this as and when it gets implemented, you've got to start thinking further than tier 1. So you've got to go down a little bit further. And how do you do that? And then how do you measure to make sure that that's actually effective? And it can be quite a challenge today for people trying to do everything at once. So my suggestion of where I've seen programs that are working really well is to map it out, work out all the stages, and then look at your timelines and make sure they're achievable.
Yeah,
actually, Vicky, I just want to say that what's great is the nodding between us, because actually we did have a coffee session and we did have a lot to talk about this week in preparation. So, I think, what is so interesting is exactly what David's saying, the trying to do everything at once, the rushing, the lack of tier visibility, the not measuring effectiveness, critical to all of this.
And as is context, people understanding the why am I doing these things? What happens if it doesn't happen? So, okay, Rory, let me come to you for a second, if that's okay. So when we think about policies, human rights or sustainability policies, what is it in your mind that makes them usable in real life, in practice?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say on this is that any of those policies will only be usable in practice if they go beyond just setting out values and principles and the basic stuff that you'd expect to see in a policy. I think they need to always be supported by proper guidance and procedures, actually explaining how due diligence is carried out across the business. And I think CS3D itself is actually quite helpful on this. I think it's Article 7 that has, at a basic level, it just says companies need to integrate due diligence throughout all of their relevant policies. But it also emphasises the fact that they need to have a proper description of the processes for implementing and integrating due diligence, as well as things like how their code of conduct is managed in the supply chain. But I think that's interesting because it means being really clear and giving solid guidance about some of the points that Colleen touched on as well. So who does what, how issues are escalated when they come up, where accountability sits within the company. And without that structure, teams might not know how to react when risks arise. And I think also on that note, employee consultation and board buy-in are both really critical in making policies work, because that's how you ensure that a policy not only reflects the operational reality, but also has that genuine ownership at senior level within a business, rather than just sitting with one function. And we've seen a lot of policies within companies that fall down because they look compliant on paper, but they don't actually guide any decision making in real situations.
Yep. And there can be that almost that looking across the room at each other to say, was that me? Was that you? Did I? Yeah. It's a really interesting point. David, do you have thoughts on this?
Yes. Last week I got up very early on Tuesday and Wednesday, and I joined a visit by two of our BV colleagues to a site in India. I was joining by team, so I didn't have to travel. And what was fascinating to me was fairly early on, we checked their policies, and they gave us 15 human rights policies. They were not agreeing with each other, and they weren't following at all what the site was actually doing in real practice. And we ended up, I think it was 87 opportunities of improvement for their policies that we actually supported them with. And when we discussed this in a lot of detail in the closing meeting, they said that they'd been creating their policies based on non-compliances they'd had at previous social audits that they'd had. So we actually tried a slightly different approach with that site. And we actually got to the bottom of their challenge, what they were struggling with. And it was just lack of understanding of what they needed to do so that they could integrate their policies into what they're actually doing. And hopefully they will find that useful. And then going forward, that will have a huge knock-on effect to the human rights actually following the local law and the relevant client codes of conduct for the workers there.
Would I be anywhere near fair to say that a lot of the companies that our businesses are working with are really trying to get it right, but are possibly getting confused without that plan, that structure, that engagement? Is there, is it fair to say that people are trying to do the right things, but they're missing the process side, David? Or
I think it's a lot of it now will start with CS3D, especially for people that need to follow that in Europe, but it will have a knock-on effect to the rest of the world. I think for a long time now, we've had this process where the site gets told they've got to have good human rights embedded, they get given a code of conduct they don't necessarily understand. Maybe they bring a consultant in that's just trying to focus on passing the audit with various different techniques. And they get their audit and then they have their issues raised and then it's the same next year. With CS3D, you've got to actually start to get those improvements. And if you don't, then there's going to be challenges for everybody in that supply chain. So I'm seeing a real appetite now for people saying, well, let's not just repeat what we've been doing for the last 20 years. Think a little bit now about how we can be more effective. Everyone has to look at cost of implementation and then things like social audits with firms like us at BV. You've got to make sure that what we're doing as well is effective. What's our role? What can we actually do? And I think going forward, there's going to be a lot of exciting updates. I'm happy to be inside watching that and helping, hopefully.
Doesn't seem to be stopping, does it? Colleen, thank you, David. I started to think about what we're talking about this afternoon in terms of procurement and sourcing decisions. In your opinion, how does due diligence get embedded into that initial sort of procurement and sourcing strategy?
Yeah, I think it's an absolutely critical question because, I mean, when I first started working and supporting business around human rights, sustainability, building processes, procurement wasn't front and center of a lot of those discussions. And now they have to be. They really need to be. They need to be front and center because there are so many different elements to the role that procurement plays in human rights due diligence and environmental due diligence. Firstly, looking at sourcing decisions, how are decisions made? Are those sourcing decisions actually leading to labor issues, exploitation of labor, modern slavery issues further down the line because of the requirements of quick turnarounds? How does that fit in from a procurement perspective and the KPIs that they might be given to save costs versus the sustainability or ESG, however people want to label it, the longer term relationship building and loyalty and shared responsibility that we see coming through in the legislation like CS3D, this concept of shared responsibility. And so looking at procurement, we also need an understanding that things have to be risk-based, that you cannot simply, you cannot simply, well, you can try, but you'll end up in a big fat mess, is if you don't segment your suppliers, if you don't look at you know, the way that you want to assess your supply chain in terms of severity, impact, your proper inherent risk assessment, you're not going to have a proportionate way of how you deal with your supplier risk and getting the oversight. And that goes back to, you know, understanding who you work with. I mean, we see this often is people don't do supply chain mapping, so they don't necessarily know who it is or where it is they operate, where these risk factors might be, and how they should deal with that. So the procurement piece around that is really important. We see a bit more around supplier onboarding. Most of it's done in Excel spreadsheet, is totally inefficient, or inefficient emails. I think we spoke about this last time, is, you know, actually the need for ensuring that you have more effective processes, online processes. We don't often see tender processes effectively incorporating human rights and modern slavery issues. We'll see, have you got a modern slavery statement? Well, that tells you very little. You know, do you have a human rights policy appended? What does that tell you about the practices of a particular business? What about performance reviews? Where do contracts sit in this? So procurement needs to be interplaying with contracts, KPIs, monitoring, again, working out of the silos. And then a sort of a last point is, you know, ensuring that you have tiered assessments, improvement plans that are workable in practice, so that procurement teams can respond proportionately to the different levels of risk. I mean, what amazes me is looking at how some companies want to deal with this. So they just want to assess all their suppliers, and then they send these poor procurement professionals to go and have a conversation with them. Well, how can you have an effective conversation in your limited 7-day, you know, day hours in a working day to go and speak to 1,000 people effectively? You can't. You need a tiered process. And those are the kind of maturity levels that I think we need to see. But I definitely think procurement needs to sit in that, working with sustainability, legal, the contracts piece.
And the reality, Colleen, is it's continuous, isn't it? This thing isn't a one shot, you know, we're happy at this point in time and we're satisfied that, you know, we're with where we are. This is about saying you've got to keep checking this thing, right? Things move. You've got to keep revisiting this thing, haven't you?
And I think just on that, the tracking piece is essential, because so the other thing we see, people sending out loads of questions. I mean, we're not talking today about the struggle for suppliers, they're getting lots of different questionnaires. But the question I always have is, it's the same as in human rights impact assessments and audits. What's coming back? Who is monitoring the responses? What kind of corrective actions are being put out there? You know, are they the kind of actions that are going to show progress, you know, visible progress in how you're going to be managing your due diligence?
Right, super. That's really interesting. David, Rory, anything to add to what Colleen's talked about there?
Yes, there's a trend that we've been seeing that sometimes purchase orders can be very difficult to estimate when they're going to come in. They can be smaller. This can lead to more human rights issues, like, for example, excessive overtime, mandatory overtime. So sometimes you can have the organisation that's actually asking for social compliance audits actually part of the actual problem that's causing the issues that get found. Going forward, when we look at CS3D, but also country-specific legislations, like Italy's got a couple legislative decrees that have been mentioned a lot in the media recently, there's going to be a lot more emphasis on those buyers, the organisations like brands and retailers, that they've got to look at what they're doing to make sure that they're not part of the problem. So they can have their code of conduct, they can have their social audits, but actually with some of these new legislations, they could almost be used against them. You've got to do more than that. So going back to Colleen's point, procurement teams really need to understand what their role is on this. And again, I can just mirror the comment of stakeholder engagement. Super important to do that with suppliers, because sometimes we talk with sites that have got all these issues and they say, well, we can't fix them, otherwise we'll lose the purchase orders to another site, or it's being caused by the customer, and they find it then very, very difficult to actually go forward on those issues.
Interesting. Guys, there's just a touch of background noise just in case anybody's able to adjust any of their settings. We can hear well, but just in case it's something we can look at. And whilst we take a pit stop, we have a couple of questions in the chat already. Remember, Q&A function for anybody who joined later. If you want to ask the guys, we're leaving a lot of time at the end to take your questions, so do use that. Super, thank you, Colleen and David. Rory, I'm going to come to you with this one. Even as recently as this week, I hear that this comment around audit fatigue or questionnaire fatigue is real, right? Suppliers are being asked, rightly so, but suppliers are being asked to demonstrate often very similar things, if not exactly the same things, in different ways for different customers. Are there things that maybe people in the call today, are there things that we can do to make the process more transferable, but obviously without compromising on quality or compliance? Are there things that you're thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a huge challenge. And we've really seen firsthand how frustrating it can be for our clients, because they get tons of different requests from different customers. I think one of the main things to bear in mind for me is always the international standards and the law that sit behind due diligence don't require you to have different due diligence processes for every customer that suits their needs perfectly. What they're looking for is a robust company level set of systems that you have in place. And the reason I say that is because the more clearly that your due diligence methodology is documented, the more you'll then be able to reuse evidence across different customer requests, because you can add some context to what you're providing to a customer to explain why your approach looks the way it does. And in my experience, lots of companies just aren't at that stage yet. They're still grappling with how to get things documented, how to build those processes. And then they find themselves spending quite a massive amount of time reacting to customer requests, because they have to, right? Commercially, you can't say no to a customer. You have to meet those requests for data and policies and all of that stuff. But that reactivity is where compliance can get really undermined. So I think that the benefit of looking at it through the lens of what your own obligations are as a business is that you can have a long-term eye on that goal of developing proper company level systems, and then you can balance the commercial aspect of providing the necessary information to your customers, but you still have the comfort of knowing that you're building an overall due diligence system that will make it easier to collate that information over time. I know from previous conversations with David that I think he'll have some practical tips on this, but I just wanted to do a quick note on the other side of this, from the buyer's perspective. I think often there's a desire to get as much data as possible and really lean on suppliers. But I think being overly prescriptive and limited in what you request from suppliers not only makes their lives harder, but it can actually make your own risk management a bit more difficult by having really specific data that might be inconsistent across the supply chain. And again, it's about what's the core goal of your due diligence. It's to take a risk-based approach to be able to cross-compare your suppliers and prioritize effort where it's needed. So there is something to be said for holding off on that more specific heightened due diligence that's very, very targeted in those initial stages.
I think the word balance there is it's probably the best way to sum it up, isn't it? It is about that balance. Yeah. Thank you, Rory. And David, I don't know the detail, but I know that you guys have started, unsurprisingly, to use AI to help with this particular topic. Just super quickly, can you just share top line what we're talking about there and what you guys are up to?
Yes, so we're very lucky at BV. Some of our senior managers created an AI tool which we have internally called Jules, and it's named after the author Jules Verne, who actually mentioned Bureau Veritas in some of his books a very long time ago. Okay. So all the data that we put into our AI tool stays on our servers, and it's totally confidential. So we can now put all sorts of data in there, as long as we're following various client and scheme rules on the use of AI and our own internal policy on AI. It can do amazing work and things like mapping, checking. It can be used a lot to help have very, very efficient processes. So, for example, with our own social audits, we've been using AI to make it the most efficient social audit. So the flow is in the right order. We've got huge amounts of guidance now for the auditor for all the different clauses. So we've done a lot of work on that to make sure that the auditor can be more efficient on site, it's less time writing up reports, but also that the output is far more useful for the site we've audited and for their buyers who are actually using the report. We've seen a lot of people are using AI badly, so they might be putting confidential data onto open source AI tools like ChatGPT. So it's like the wild, wild west out there for AI. We're using it increasingly more, but we're super aware of things like hallucinations, where AI can just do something totally unexpected and give you a really crazy answer. So everything we do with AI is cross-checked by human experts. And we're now starting to do things like auditing AI to make sure that we're not heavily reliant, because can you imagine if we used it for a huge piece of work and then we found the AI was wrong, we'd have to repeat all that work, which would be absolutely crazy. Yeah. We're starting to see sites using AI as well. And some of them are terrible, and some of them are starting to be quite interesting when they're using it to embed their policies. Lots of people have got policies, but they're not relevant to their site. So we're just starting to see at audits now, some sites are starting to do this, which is fascinating for us.
It is fascinating, and I know you could talk to us for hours about this thing, and I'd love to, but I think we're gonna move us on, because AI, you know, and things around that, we do have some more sessions coming up, but it's good to know that we are sort of keeping with the times and moving with these things. Thanks, David. Rory, let me come back to you. What does good engagement look like beyond the audit itself?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really interesting one as well. I mean, we know that audits alone don't meet legal or best practice expectations, especially when you don't have, you know, evidence of progress being made over time. But what really matters is whether the findings from those audits are leading to the prevention and remediation of impacts that are identified. So, you know, a few years ago, you'd see a lot more companies that are just reporting on the number of audits conducted and maybe the number passed, and they'd be quite happy with that. But I think the puzzle piece diagram that we have on screen, and one of the key pieces to me is collaboration. I think in terms of effective supplier engagement. So rather than having just a corrective action sheet that goes out to a supplier and places all the onus on them to fix all the problems that have been flagged and then moving on, I think it's really important to see that relationship as a collaborative partnership. I think Colleen mentioned that shared responsibility point earlier. And to make that slightly more practical, I think it means that the customer needs to assign ownership and accountability on their side to engage with the supplier. That can be in whatever format works best and is reasonable for that company, really. But making sure that that person, there's someone assigned to having ongoing engagement as opposed to a one-off set of recommendations that go to a supplier, because that ongoing engagement really allows you to get to the root causes of issues. Absolutely. And also build the supplier's capacity over time. But we often see that that's missing, and I think it makes a huge difference.
So we don't want the big stick approach, Rory. That's not working for people, right? Yeah, okay.
Exactly.
Listen, guys, we're making good progress, but there's a lot to go through. So, Colleen, let me come over to you if I can. How do companies move from risk assessment to an implementation roadmap? Oh, you might be on mute again, Colleen.
I was just saying, another huge question with my 4 minutes, if I'm lucky, to get through it. Yeah, so how are you going to move from your risk assessment to your implementation? I think that a really critical piece to keep highlighting is that not all risks need to be addressed at once. There has to be a rationale for sequencing how you and documenting how you're going to move from your risk to your actions. And so going right back to, you know, where do we start? We need to have a analysis around, you know, where is my risk? So what is the likelihood of severity? What is the likelihood of something arising? What is, you know, is it remedial? Isn't it? So, and looking at your supply chain mapping to make that, you know, to really have an understanding of what your risk is and then how you're going to implement it. So I think, again, going back to process, if I think about this in a very practical sense, many companies have, you know, thousands of suppliers, and now they're being asked to assess them. Now they're thinking about how they do this. Some of them might want to assess all of them at once, saying, here's a questionnaire, how we do this. We've seen how that fails, because you're not going to get the engagement you want from your suppliers, and you're not thinking about it as a risk-based process. So there has to be that really upfront consideration of your prioritization of risks. Where am I operating? What are the sectors that are the highest risk? What is my spend? What are some of the other categories that I might start filtering down who my key suppliers are? And then also thinking about what are the types of questions I might want to ask them. How are those questions weighted? I mean, we have a supply chain due diligence tool. It weighs up the answers and the responses so that a client is able to see very clearly, these are my high risk, my medium risk, my low risk suppliers. That gives you the opportunity to then decide, when you're talking about implementing a roadmap, how I'm going to deal with them. I also don't often see a properly articulated process around how you manage this. So again, you might have your question sets, you might have people engaging. From a sustainable procurement process point of view, understanding also how are you going to deal with current suppliers, future suppliers, preferential suppliers, what are your thresholds in terms of where you ask questions, how do you document who you're going to audit? Is it a SEDEX audit? Is it an on-site audit? Is it not an audit? Is it a conversation? All of that in terms of implementing a roadmap needs to be considered of how you're going to document the process. And I think that goes to Rory's point earlier. Companies do these things in bits, but when you want to become more efficient, you need to bring it together. And that also is the piece that it helps efficiencies internally. It helps address risk management, legal liability. I'm going to stop there because I think I'm sure David's got quite a lot to say about this. Why haven't I spoken about Andrew? Who's Andrew? I think David.
For an afternoon.
Yeah, no.
David, do you have any thoughts or maybe anything to challenge with what Colleen's talking about?
I think I've just got two top tips to add to that. The first thing, Colleen mentioned SMETA before. So those of you who don't know it, it's one of the very big social compliance audit schemes. It's been around since 2002, so it's very mature. Well, one thing I would suggest, if you've had a SMETA audit, convert that corrective action plan and report that you've had into time-bound actions. So if you have some sort of a finding, whether it's a non-compliance or a collaborative action required, split that down into smaller steps, put times on it, have accountabilities for who's going to work on it, and then talk with your customer, either via that platform or directly, to let them know what you're doing. And sometimes you will see that some of those actions actually need that buyer to be involved as well.
Yeah.
And then the second tip is, before you start that huge program and ask everybody to jump, maybe just try a small pilot before you scale it up.
Yeah, wait, listen, you say it's an obvious one, but it's such an important step, isn't it, David? Don't kind of roll this thing out en masse until you've tested it, until you've seen it's working for your business. Now, it's a really fair point. Okay, Rory, I'm going to come back to you for something. We'd like to think that, the audits and the assessments always go to plan and we don't find anything we don't want to see, but it's not real, is it? So how do companies respond, or how should companies respond when adverse impacts are identified? Have you got any tips you can share with people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think first thing I'd say, and I'm sure people have heard a version of this before, it's almost a bit of a cliche, but the first thing is to say that successfully identifying impacts isn't a sign of failure, but failing to act would be a failure. So it's a positive sign that your due diligence is actually working. And I think the response within the company and externally as well should be framed in that way, that, this is an opportunity for us to conduct proper due diligence, having identified risks. It's not something to hide away from. And again, it's another big topic that, just as a quick plug, we will be going into this in the 4th session, I think, of this series, so we'll be able to explore this in a lot more detail. But just for one point I wanted to focus in on a bit was we've been working with several clients on response frameworks and remediation protocols and things like that, and those are really valuable tools for a business to have, because again, like you say, you hope that you never have to use them and everything works perfectly, but what they give you is a very practical step-by-step approach to follow when things do go wrong, or when adverse impacts are identified. And again, that's a documented process that evidences your due diligence, but also a means of recording all of your decisions throughout the process. So the rationale behind the decision to make X move with a particular supplier, how those outcomes were monitored, and what the outcome was. And those are all critical elements to be able to have a defensible process for how you're responding to impacts.
Some really good tips in there, actually. I hadn't thought about a couple of those. That was great, Rory. David, you see this through a slightly different lens. Anything to add to what Rory was sharing there?
Yes. Yeah, I've got a completely different answer, which is interesting. Sometimes when we see there's an adverse impact, it's been identified, there's a huge rush to get it closed. Sometimes somebody can actually just put a sticking plaster on it, and that can be enough, for example, for a critical non-compliance to be closed, but then it might come back. So checking that effectiveness can be good. I remember sitting down with a retailer one day last summer, and I tracked audits that we had done on a particular site for 10 years, and the issue had never gone away. So they had excessive overtime one year, they had lack of vacation days another, they had working without a day off a week in another, missing rest breaks, but there was a trend for 10 years in a row. There were major and critical issues on that one topic. And each time there had been a follow-up audit or something else to close off the issue, but it wasn't actually embedded into the site's psyche. So it just kept on coming back. They didn't understand how to fix it. They didn't understand the benefits to them or their workers on how to fix it. So when you have these adverse things coming up, try and work out a solution where everybody is actually a winner on this. And that's the real trick. And again, I'm seeing here, this is what Colleen and Rory are doing a lot with their role. So they can actually take a slightly different approach. I remember once attending a conference where Professor John Ruggie was giving a keynote speech. And this was about 15 years ago, but I can remember it as if it was yesterday. He said, farmers often take a pig to market and you weigh them before you go. Doesn't matter how many times you weigh that pig, it's going to weigh the same. If you want to get more money, you've got to give it more exercise, better nutrition, and then you'll get some better value. And it's the same with audits. You can audit sites to death and nothing changes. You've got to actually look and then find out these root causes, and then find a solution that doesn't just work for the brand or the retailer or buyer. It's got to work for everybody else in the supply chain as well.
That puts it into focus. I remember you telling me that story about a year or so ago, and it stuck with me actually. So it's a good one. David, thanks very much indeed. So retailers in particular, they're reassessing things as they're preparing for CS DDD. What does that transition look like? And I think we've got a bit of an example that we want to spend 2 or 3 minutes on. David, if you want to share that.
Yes. Traditionally, retailers and brands have had their supply code of conduct. They do social audits, various different methods of doing this, various different companies doing this. You can have first party, second party, third party audits. And they seem to be the primary tool. There's on the previous slide, there was a picture of a jigsaw puzzle. And I think audits can be one part of that jigsaw puzzle, but it's not the only thing that you can do. So you can have the traditional process, and you can have maybe some follow-ups, maybe they're not very effective. And the challenge now, when you look at CS 3D and other legislations for the buyers, they could actually be used now as evidence against you. So if you've got a code of conduct, you've had an audit, and those issues aren't closed off, or if they're not found because it's ineffective, that's your due diligence gap. And you can now start to get various penalties as these legislations come in. I think Rory can put a bit more detail on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say that's we've also had a similar scenario with clients where we've looked at their audit history and seen the same things repetitively coming up, and then it gives rise to that slightly uncomfortable question as to what they're actually demonstrating by doing all of that work. But we found that the real trigger for change was when the client realized that the legal focus was moving away from just showing intent, having oversight and gathering as much data as possible, towards being able to show what you're actually doing to respond and implement. And as you say, at the same time, that awareness that your purchasing practices themselves and the absence of a structured approach to responding and remediating exposes even more legal risk, especially where in cases where you have that knowledge of issues without evidence of taking any action in response.
Colleen, I know you're thinking about things. Anything to add to what the gents are saying?
I'm thinking about things. Yeah, I think that the real so just thinking about a lot of businesses, people who are listening here, and for them, a lot of this is about your managing your risk, saving yourselves money, making yourselves money. And so, how do I build a defensible due diligence system, something that actually is going to stand up to scrutiny, that's going to, enforce my good reputation? And, going back to this, I think we've talked about it earlier on. We need to think about risk. We need to think about continuous improvement, not just exactly as David said, just a one-off audit and then not a non-conformance that goes on and on and on for years and years, actually working out ways of how you might move that forward, embedding your due diligence across your supply chain, your processes, your procurement, and then strengthening your documentation. I mean, I know we don't have time to discuss it today. I think we might pick it up in 3 and 4, but actually, what does an effective social management compliance system look like? How can we build something that brings in engagement, but that gives the strategic teams, the boards of the executive boards, assurance around their legal protection and other things? And those are things I think you need to be considering when you're addressing this sort of tick box exercise versus building something that's much more embedded.
I think that summarises well. And actually, I just looked at the time. We've been talking now for about 45 minutes, and we could go on, but I'm actually going to bring us through to final thoughts, so we leave a bit of time for Q&A. So, listen, lots to think about, and some questions have come in, which is super to see. David, from this discussion, if there were 2 or 3 things that you said, listen, these are the real key things to, if you take nothing else away, what would they be for you and why?
I always go back to my family motto. My dad's been doing lots of research, and he told me a few years ago, our family motto is to be rather than to seem. And in this context, it's moving from compliance to action. So I'm sure with these legislations that are coming, you can't just do an audit, file it, move on to the next one. You've got to actually work with it, make sure those issues that have been raised have actually been found as step 1. And then step 2, have people actually started to resolve them.
Okay, super. Thanks, David. Colleen, a couple of things that you would say are the key takeaways for you from this.
Yeah, I mean, 2 are obviously very bound up in what the law and legal risk, we've talked about in respect of ensuring that your implementation, not just your policy drafting, is actually effective. So companies doing what they say, which is exactly what you're saying as well, David, to be rather than to see. So making sure they doing what they're saying, making sure that when you prioritize, in terms of your risk, it is risk-based, it's defensible, engaging your suppliers properly to lever remediation and responses that are effective. But I hadn't, one of the things I think that probably is often left out in these discussions, and for me personally, I think is something, given the geopolitical situation we all live in today, is probably more important, which is, how am I going to do the right thing? How am I going to ensure that the conditions that I create for my workforce and the people that produce goods or services for me are fair and equitable? And I think that I do want to challenge that, because I feel like there needs to be some more questioning around what is the right thing to do, notwithstanding what we see in a completely crazy world at the moment.
And it's probably not going to slow down all that much, is it? We already know there's a few moving parts. Guys, thank you so much. I promised our audience today we would leave time for Q&A, and I want to do that. So that's where we're going to go next, guys. Now, looking at the questions, I don't think I'm going to get to all of these, but I'm going to get to as many as I can. Any that we don't get to, we will write to you directly. The guys will write to you directly with a full response. But let's use the next few minutes to take some of those. David, I'm picking these at random, but I think this one might sit well with you to start us off at least. I found overtime is a challenge with suppliers in China. When this is raised as a non-conformance, the supplier's response is often that it's common practice and their employees want to do overtime. How do we address this, given also the context?
It's very common. I mean, the first time I went to China to watch social audit, there was huge excessive overtime, and the site had absolutely no thought to actually change anything at all. And in some countries, the local authorities don't even mind if the local law isn't followed. It's all about purchase orders, volume, profit. Mm-hmm. The only way that excessive overtime can actually be fixed is if all the stakeholders have a win-win-win here. There was an amazing piece of work done by a consulting company in the Ethical Trade Initiative some years ago on excessive overtime. And there was a huge amount of amazing brains were working on how to solve it. But the only ones I saw that actually got fixed were where there were solutions in place. So longer term contracts with the supply chain, so they can actually invest in either new machinery or recruiting extra people. Something that we've been trying to do more recently at BV is think about some of these issues that never get fixed, mm-hmm. and then what can we do about it? So we've started to create with our BV Academy some training courses on these topics, and that is one of them. It's a mixture of understanding why you've got this, what are the root causes, and then how do you start to put solutions in place. We can't offer that training at BV at the site level because that would be a huge conflict of interest. But again, this is, I'm assuming with Rory and Colleen, the sort of work that they will jump on. So if anybody's got issues, I don't know, one of you two, if you'd like to jump in on that specific question.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm sure Rory's got something to say about this too. I mean, interestingly, China is absolutely right, but I've seen this as an issue also in Malaysia, other aspects of Asia, and just an example of working with a client a few years ago about this particular challenge. Where you have a bit more leverage, and that's often the issue. You don't have enough leverage at a factory level or a site level to change things. But if you have some more leverage, what I saw with this one particular client was very much, that training piece as well, but going and getting an understanding from the factory why this was happening. So it would have been, purchase orders, requirements to do things, the cultural piece, but actually also there was getting them to understand that rest periods means you work more effectively, proper accommodation, you rest properly. If you are happier, you're going to work better. And this particular factory, they changed the whole culture. I mean, it was interesting because there was perhaps a perception that factories weren't interested. It was just the culture. But actually, when they started understanding the impact to their workers and what that could result in, it really changed things around. And I'm not saying this is a one size fits all. I completely, from the person who raised this question, I completely get, China's more intransigent. It's much more difficult perhaps. But I do think, to David's point, training, finding ways that you can try and support these factories, that is really critical. And, procurement again.
Guys, thank you. Let's get to another one. I don't know who wants to take this one. I'm going to let you guys decide, actually. So there's a question here. Do you have an example of supplier consultation to improve procurement processes? At what step? What kind of questions? So obviously this is a written response, but any initial thoughts that we want to share?
Sounds like a consultancy question to me.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know if you want to step in, Rory. Otherwise,
yeah, we've got. I was just thinking because there's a few examples, different. Just trying to narrow it down because there's so many stages where you can consult suppliers as part of a procurement process. I mean, we've worked with clients who do that as part of early on in their their supplier code of conduct development. They'll speak to suppliers and get feedback on, you know, are these standards realistic for you? What's going to be a challenge? What can we give you more support on? But then also at the other end of the scale, we've found it's really useful. Colleen mentioned earlier our Tabra due diligence platform. Before we start doing assessments on that platform, we do some upfront engagement with suppliers, which you can do in a lot of different ways, but you could just do it as simply as an open webinar to suppliers to come and join. And we found that really helpful in terms of framing the risk assessment work that we were doing in a way so that the suppliers understood where it was coming from, that there was a legal requirement for the client. This wasn't a kind of spot check on suppliers that was going to result in them having their contracts ripped up and being blacklisted. It's really important to get that messaging across, and it worked really well, getting that, like I mentioned earlier, that partnership messaging across to say, if you have gaps, we will give you recommendations to help close those gaps. And also just allowing the two-way dialogue, because I mean, if you open the door to suppliers to ask questions and comment on the process, trust me, they will definitely take the opportunity to give feedback and clarify things. So it's definitely not hard to get the feedback.
Yeah,
It actually it links to another question actually, which I'm going to take one more. Thank you for that, Rory. And I'll ask both companies actually on this one. So once the issues are identified, what are the risks with terminating suppliers too quickly, and how should companies approach remediation?
Oh, shall I start? My first thought here, again for Europeans, is CS3D. The aim of that directive is to drive positive change throughout supply chains rather than just cutting ties when problems arise. So termination is permitted, but it is heavily restricted. It emphasises engagement, support, corrective action. So buyers need to exhaust all reasonable measures to help suppliers before they consider termination. But going back a few years, we would have these critical non-compliance that were called zero tolerances. And we would see brands and retailers instantly pulling away. And sometimes that can make the situation worse for human rights for the workers, because suddenly there's no purchase orders coming in and they don't get any money, they lose their jobs, they're out on the street. So the whole moral question sitting behind that is huge.
Yeah, I bet. Rory, Colleen, what are you thinking about with this one?
do you want to have a go, Rory? Can add to you?
Yeah, I think definitely echo those points, David. I think we've seen that in in agriculture, particularly, where it can massively worsen impacts for workers. You know, removing income stability without addressing any of the underlying issues. And I think that's, you know, we always say that termination needs to be a last resort, so you can actually understand and address root causes of things rather than just walking away and passing that supplier onto someone else. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Colleen.
No, I think again, you know, to me, the whole point about remediation comes back to how are you designing your due diligence system? You know, it goes to design because it goes to values. It goes to the whole way that you're going to be operating your business. So understanding if these things come up, what you're going to do. I mean, I just want to put this in the context. When I practiced as an environmental lawyer, I remember thousands of agreements where we had default provisions. You know, when something happens, you have 30 days to fix this, or 60 days, and then we terminate. And there are different layers that were built into those sort of massive agreements that we used to do. But it's the same principle. It's understanding at the outset, what do you want to achieve? How do you want that to be achieved? How do I do that within the legal framework and the sort of standards that exist? To get there? And that means, you know, some really upfront thinking, not just defensiveness. Oh dear, let's quickly get out. You know, there might well be reasons where you get out, but, you know, understand when those triggers come and what your actions are going to be.
I was thinking, do I take one more question? But I'm so sorry, we don't have time. So to the people who have asked questions, thank you for your questions. We will get back to you really quickly with full written responses. But we are about to reach time. So at this point, I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. And of course, to our fabulous speakers, thank you so much for sharing your experiences, your honest reviews of things. I thought it was a great session. Don't forget session 3. This is a 4-part series. So session 3 is on the 25th And next time we'll also bring in Laura from our Italian team, and we're moving in actually to the ACT phase. So we're moving through the processes. If you have colleagues or stakeholders who missed the call and would like to listen to it on demand, we will make sure you get a recorded version of the discussion. And at the end of our series, actually, you'll get what we call a wrap-up pack. So we will have written key takeaways from each of the 4 discussions. We also have a white paper, which is quite interesting, linked to what we're talking about. And, you know, if you need anything in between now and the next session, don't hesitate to make contact with us. We'd be very happy to help. So I wish everybody listening a wonderful day. Stay safe. To our speakers, thank you genuinely, and we will see you hopefully on the 25th.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys. Bye.